Fill to capacity. Crazy good stories and timely topics. Podcast for people too stubborn to quit and too creative not to make a difference. Inspiring, irreverent, and informative. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Pat Benincasa, and welcome to Fill to Capacity. Today's episode, Respected Guide of Paranormal and Unexplained Mysteries. My guest today is none other than Jim Harold. And if you listen to podcasts, you know who he is. And you know him through Jim Harold's Campfire and his paranormal podcasts, just to name a few. So welcome, Jim. It's a big deal having you here today. So thank you for joining us.
Well, it's a big deal to be here, to be on your show. And thank you so much, Pat. I appreciate it and glad to be able to spend some time with you and your audience today to talk about some spooky stuff.
Okay, so I just want to start by saying that Apple came out with the iPod in 2001, and everybody was using it for music.
Mm-hmm.
But you saw other possibilities with it, that this device could inform and entertain listeners. So you took it in a whole different direction starting in 2005.
Yeah, what happened was that I heard about this thing called podcasting, and I had gone to school for broadcasting, mainly television more so than radio. But I ended up working in the business for radio stations, but I worked in the business side, and I was always frustrated I never got in front of the mic, darn it. And by that time, by 2005, I had a wife, 2 kids, a mortgage, all those responsibilities. I couldn't just go off to some small market and pursue that. So 2004, podcasting actually started. So I was one of the early people, but I was not by any means the earliest. And I heard about it, and I heard that people were making homemade shows. And I thought, well, that would be fun as a hobby. So actually, it's funny, you mentioned the iPod. I think I got my first iPod sometime May or June of that year, 2005. And Apple just had added podcasts to iTunes at the time. And I said, you know what? I listened to some of the really great professional people who were doing broadcasters like Leo Laporte, Adam Curry, people like that. And I'm like, I don't know if I can do that. But then I listened to some of the homemade ones. And I'm like, I can do that. So I started as a hobby in 2005. Long story short, got really serious in 2008. 2012, I quit my full-time job and started doing this full-time. And I've been doing this full-time for almost 11 years now. And it's been quite the journey, and all the time exploring the supernatural and the paranormal, which when I decided to do a podcast, I had to think of a topic that I was really going to enjoy, because I realized if I was going to do this for a long period of time, it had to be something I loved.
Well, that brings me to the, why the paranormal? Of all the things you could have talked about, right. How did you come to that?
Well, because I had and have, amazingly, after 18 years, have a fascination with it. Going back to when I was a little kid, you might remember a show called In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy.
Yep.
And I loved that show as a little kid. I couldn't get enough of it. And then I started reading on different things, the Bermuda Triangle and UFOs and ghosts. And I maintained that through my growing up years. So when I was thinking about a topic for a podcast, I thought, I want to do something that is not being overdone, something where maybe I can offer something unique. So I thought different topics. Music, you can't really do music on a podcast. Still can't, ridiculously, 18 years later, at least, popular music or anything like that. Politics, I don't want to argue with people.
Yep.
Sports, I'm a sports fan, but I'm not going to add anything in that arena. But the paranormal, I thought the great thing about the paranormal is there are no experts. We're all questioning and we're all wondering. And it's something I was fascinated with. Every time I go in a library or a bookstore, that'd be the section I'd head right to. And the section was never big enough.
Yep.
And I thought, but the thing, Pat, what was funny was when I started this, I thought, this will be great. I'll do this for 6 months. I'll get to talk to all these great thinkers, and then I will have it all figured out.
Ah,
Not
okay.
so much. Not so much. I have more questions today, but I am proud to say, as far as I know, and I'm willing to be corrected on this, but I have not been corrected yet that I know of. The Paranormal Podcast, the first show I started, which continues to this day, is the longest running podcast on the paranormal on the internet. And when I first started, there were a handful of those. Most, as far as I know, when I started, the ones I started, I think the rest of them dropped off. There were other ones that are still going strong that started a few months after me. But as far as I know, the Paranormal Podcast is the longest running podcast on the paranormal on the internet, which is kind of a neat thing.
So I have to say here, what is remarkable that since 2005, starting with your Paranormal Podcast, you have that podcast plus Jim Harold's Campfire Podcast, and with the other ones that you started, you have over 60 million downloads and produced over 2,600 episodes. Oh, and let's not forget you've authored 5 books. Do you sleep? Do you ever sleep?
Well, but I have the benefit of this being my full-time job. Now, when it was really difficult was that time between 2008 and 2012 when I was working a full-time job and basically doing this full-time too. And I did some of those books then, actually. That's when it was really crazy. But I was a little bit younger then. I don't know that I could do that now. But, not that I'm not busy. I mean, I walk in, I have a home studio here, as you can see on video. And, I treat it very seriously. I have good equipment and the whole thing. It's sound treated and the whole thing. But the point is that I treat this very seriously. Yeah. I may work from home and work for myself, but I work probably harder than I ever have on any other job I've ever had. And I come in here and I have a to-do list and I go down and do this and do this and do this. And I work long days. I'll do stuff in the evenings when it's called for. I'll do stuff on the weekends when it's called for, because I really enjoy doing it. And I'm very blessed and very thankful for the opportunity to do this for a living and talk with people like you. I think it's a pretty neat way.
Well, okay. I have to tell you, I'm going to fess up here. You are starting to sound like an artist, because to an artist, 10 hours in the studio, 12, it doesn't matter. It's a passion. It's a joy. And you bring that to your podcast. Now, because I am an artist, I always like to look at the big picture. I like looking at popular culture. And so just for a moment, if we look at TV shows, I'm going to list some TV shows, just the starting dates. Twilight Zone, 1959. Alcoa Presents One Step Beyond. 1959.
Great
Outer
show.
Limits, 1963. In Search of, your favorite, 1977. Unsolved Mysteries, 1987. The X-Files, 1993. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, 97. Charmed, 1998. And then The Unexplained, 2019. Now, when we look at all these popular shows, it seems that people have always had this interest in the paranormal. And yet there's this kind of debunking or to ridicule someone who's had this kind of experience when they come forward. What's your thought about that?
I think sometimes people are, unfortunately, they're embarrassed, and their own embarrassment about their own experiences makes them project onto other people, make fun of people. For example, my most popular show is called Jim Harold's Campfire. And that's where people call in with their personal experiences. And these are just everyday people. We've had everything from doctors to lawyers to car mechanics, landscapers, stay-at-home moms. I mean, we've had the gamut of different people on the show. I will talk to people, when I'm out and about, and I'll say, especially I remember this when I used to work at the day job. And I would say, I do this show, and it's like they'll say something like, that crazy stuff. there was this one time, and then they tell their story.
Yep.
And I believe almost everybody, even the most hardcore skeptic, has a one-time story of something they couldn't make sense of. Good example, Dr. Michael Shermer, who I don't know if he still is, but he was the editor of Skeptic magazine. He's probably, at one point, he was probably one of the best known skeptics out there, other than the late James Randi. But I interviewed him on the show and on the Paranormal Podcast. And actually, he was a very nice guy. There's some, quote, skeptics who are nasty about it and mean. Whereas Dr. Shermer was, and I appreciated this, my belief in life is we don't have to agree about everything, but let's not be disagreeable.
Mm-hmm.
So we disagreed, and he explained his reasons why, but he was a good guy about it. So I respect him. But even him, this erudite, very smart man, no question at all, wrote a piece in Scientific American about an experience that many may have interpreted as supernatural, and even he kind of questioned it for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So even the most hardcore skeptic, and you're probably hard to find a more hardcore skeptic than Michael Shermer, has a story. So I think sometimes it is people joke about things just to joke, but sometimes I think it's almost like an insecurity defense mechanism. What if this stuff is real? What if I don't understand everything? What if there are ghosts or space aliens, or one that even I'm skeptical about sometimes? What if there is a Bigfoot?
Yep.
So I guess it boils down to this for me, is that, I think it's becoming more accepted through popular entertainment, like all those great shows you mentioned. You mentioned Twilight Zone. I love that. That's one I was just watching it the other night. One Step Beyond is interesting because it was a precursor to the Twilight Zone. Many people aren't familiar with it, but it really kind of laid the groundwork for the Twilight Zone, and all the other great ones that you mentioned. So I think that sometimes people are more interested than they let on.
Yep.
But they don't want to put it out there. Hey, I'm interested in this
Then
stuff.
let me flip that coin. Of everything you've talked about on your shows, and my God, it runs a fascinating gamut from skinwalkers, UFOs, ghosts. I mean, you name it, you have talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a paranormal phenomenon that you personally you had to really grapple with it, and you're not still quite convinced?
I mentioned it, Bigfoot.
Okay.
Now, for example, I will say this, because I am a great respecter of people's experiences.
Okay.
For example, when people come on Campfire, it's not a debate society. I take them on face value that what they said happened to them. We respect them and want to make a place where they can tell their story without fear of judgment or anything like that. So I'll make that clear. And many Bigfoot reports have been by people who should know: forestry workers, hunters, people who work in the wilderness. So I value their experiences, but still, with Bigfoot, I do have a bit of a question, because my question has always been, why don't we find physical evidence? And I know people have said that there have been print casts, and of course there's that great and actually very interesting Patterson-Gimlin film of 1967, that kind of famous one where the Bigfoot is sashaying across the wilderness. And if you look at that stabilized, it becomes way more convincing because it looks like muscle tone, not a costume. But on the other hand, I do the kind of, I have a master's degree in communication and studied social science. So I know a little bit about the idea of evidence and how you shouldn't just jump to conclusions. I do wonder, here's my inner skeptic speaking about Bigfoot, why haven't we found DNA? Why haven't we found fur? I say, why haven't we found a body? And I know what, Bigfoot believers will say. They will say, well, nature takes care of its own. You don't usually walk through the woods and find the carcass of a bear or a deer. But I'm like, wouldn't we find something, a bone or something? So that's probably the one that I struggle with the most. Now, when it comes to strange creatures or cryptid creatures, we call them, I have a great belief in the idea of sea creatures or creatures under the water, because it's said that we know less about the deep ocean than we do deep space.
Yeah.
So who is to say, and new things are being discovered in the ocean all the time, that people aren't seeing things surface from time to time and that they are real. So I don't rule out the idea of cryptids or strange, unusual creatures altogether. Just Bigfoot sometimes I do struggle with a little bit.
Okay. I think what we're really talking about here is mystery. And mystery is really a pain in the ass because it's so messy. You
Yeah.
can't just explain it. And it seems that a lot of people resist what they don't understand. And
Right.
yet we're drawn to mystery. If I look at that deeper, it seems that we need to peel away layers of meaning because we know that the universe is so much bigger than what we understand. And I like when Julia Cameron says, think mystery, not mastery.
Mm-hmm.
But there's always this kind of push and pull that, well, if I can't understand it, it must not be real.
Right, exactly. And that's the thing. Pat, people will say, well, what have you learned from doing these shows all these years? There's one thing I think I've learned, and I'm utterly convinced of this one thing. The nature of reality and the nature of our existence is so much more than we give it credit for.
Yes.
It's so much deeper. There's so much more going on. There's so much that is here, but we don't see through our senses. It's like ultraviolet light, right? It's there. We don't see it. So, I mean, some of these things may be science, but they may be the science of the 25th century.
Yep.
I mean, for example, I'll give you a perfect example that I use on the shows. DNA. Now, ostensibly, of course, DNA has existed forever, right? But we didn't know about it. That didn't mean it didn't exist. We just didn't know about it.
Yeah.
And that's the way I look at a lot of this. So I think that, you can really go down the rabbit hole. You can go down the rabbit hole with things like, are we living in a simulation? And to me, a simulation sounds a whole lot like a universe that has a creator, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you think about it on one level, that's essentially what it is. And then you think about things like retrocausality. That was a concept I was introduced to a few years ago that blew me away. The idea that what you do in the past could impact, no, what you do now could impact, I can't even say it because it's so mind-bending. What you do today could actually impact your past.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give you an example. How that could work is the fact I'm doing this now as a podcaster and having my own business. The reason I can do this, I think, and have had a little bit more luck than most is because I know the business side of broadcasting. Okay. And that's what I worked in. The whole time I was doing it, I was kind of cursing the universe saying, I'm stuck here schlepping these ads and all this stuff. Best thing that ever happened to me. Because I think I had always had the, broadcasting ability. I mean, I need to be honed, and I still feel, even at my advancing years, I still feel that I'm getting better. But because I didn't have that 20 years of practice that a lot of people have. Most people my age, if they're in broadcasting, they've been doing it in front of the mic for 30 years.
Yep.
I've only been, podcasting for 18. So I feel I'm a little behind on that, but I feel like I'm getting better all the time. But the point is I have that business part that allowed me to do both sides of the business, which most people can do one or they can do the other. They can't do both. But back to retrocausality. What I'm doing now may have somehow spurred on what happened to me in the past so I could do this job. Mind-bending, but that's a concept we've talked about on the shows. So, I mean, really, if you start getting into this stuff, it can really kind of upend you. Mentally upend you from kind of your paradigm. You see the world in a whole different way and realize, wow, we really don't have it figured out, do we?
No, we don't. And really, for me, in this discussion, the gatekeeper is our perception of time. In Western culture, we keep it linear, logical, scientific. Yet we time travel continuously throughout our day. We dream at night. We have reverie. We daydream. We have deja vu. We have all these different modalities of time travel.
Mm-hmm.
But if you say it like that, you sound like a nut job, like, well, now, wait a minute, it's not logical. But how we look at time and what, like bending time,
Right.
fourth dimensions, fifth dimensions. How willing are we to let go of our perception of time as linear entity?
That's one of the great mysteries to me is time, because I think if you have the answer to that, and I don't know that we'll ever get the answer, but
No.
if you had the answer to that, it would give you the answer to so much more.
It's connected. It just seems so connected. Now, I want to shift gears here. The Jim Harold Media Network, you list 11 different podcasts. Now, is this a family affair?
Well, it's kind of evolved that way. That was not the way it started. But, my main shows are me. But over the last couple of years, I've tried to get my family more involved. For example, my youngest daughter, Natalie, she's not on the mic, but she does a lot of editing, and she's quite good at it. And I'm kind of not a mean dad, but when it comes to this stuff, I'm very serious.
Okay.
So for example, we edit in a program called Adobe Audition. So I have taught her how to use it. And if it's not up to my standard, if I listen to something and it's not up to my standard, I kick it back to her and say, okay, here's what you did wrong. Here's what you need to fix it.
Okay.
Because it's not like, and again, so my youngest is in college. My oldest just graduated in the last couple of years. So we're not talking little kid. I'm not doing child labor here.
Okay.
And they get paid. I mean, they get paid. They're on a payroll and they get paid just like, anybody else. It's the hours of work they get paid. They have an hourly rate, and that's the way that works. My oldest daughter triple majored and minored in drama. Actually got to study in London a little bit right before the pandemic, and then had to race back home during that mess in March of 2020. She has definitely some dramatic skills. So we started a show called Unpleasant Dreams. It's in its third season. Started out as kind of like a recap of different paranormal cases. And to be honest with you, she's not as much into this stuff as I am. So, but what she is into is literature. She loves literature. So what we did is we went back and we said, okay, well, let's see what we can do with the concept of the show, just changing it up a little bit. And what we've done this season is we have had her reading stories by Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe and all these kind of classic horror stories, which, are fiction, but still, like you were talking about those classic TV shows, they're still of interest to people who are interested in these kind of things. So, in fact, we just posted part 2 of The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe.
Oh, nice.
So, and it's all public domain stuff, so we don't have to worry about getting in trouble, and we're not infringing on anybody or anything. We're using things that are out there. And then the latest thing we've been doing, and again, I'm very much like a mad scientist here. I will try a format for a show, and if I don't think it's working or it's not resonating with the audience, I will change it. So I was doing a show starting last year with my wife called You Won't Believe What Happened to Me. And it was kind of like Campfire without the ghosts.
Okay.
It was people calling in with like incredible stuff that happened to them. There's some very good stories. I mean, one about a man who went to Mexico and was almost kidnapped, and that kind of thing's in the news. And all these different things that happened to people. But for some reason, it seemed to need something else. So the beginning of this year, we kept a story or two from the listeners every show. So we still have that component kind of honing in on the best stories. But then we do kind of a fun survey of some of the strange news. And that's really a non-paranormal show. Like, for example, there was a gentleman just set a world's Guinness World Book record for, and I didn't even know this was a thing, how many Q-tips he was able to stuff into his beard. Now, I didn't know that.
Wait. How many Q-tips he could stuff in his beard?
Into his beard. Yeah, I think it was 2,300. And he could have done more had he bought more. So we do like silly stories like that. And that's a fun thing for me and my wife to do. And she's a speech therapist and sits and does teletherapy every day. So she's very good with communication. And that's a fun thing we've been doing and getting really good. I've been really happy because I was like, was this the right move to change that format? Sure enough, the audience has been loving it and letting us know. So I'm very happy about that. So those are my free shows.
Okay.
And then we have a number of shows that are for our Plus members. The Other Side, UFO Encounters, The Cryptid Report, Ghost Insight. So we have a bunch of those shows. And also I do periodic lives, usually a couple times a month on YouTube. And we'll occasionally pop a standalone video on YouTube too. So it really has become a little media company, and it's
Yes.
also become, as you said, a family affair, because all four of us, to varying degrees, are working on different projects in it.
Wow, that's quite an enterprise. So that makes me wonder, of all your paranormal guests who you've had,
Mm-hmm.
who has touched your heart or changed your life?
You know, one person who I really enjoyed, I mean, there are a few, but the one that comes to mind, probably my favorite all-time guest, is the late Rosemary Ellen Guiley.
Okay.
She was a researcher, and she came from a hard-boiled journalism background. She worked for newspapers, and she started, I think, in the 80s or 90s, writing on the supernatural, ghosts, and those kind of things, and just was prolific. She was literally on my show, and I think each time for a different book. She was on my show 20 times. And she was one of the most knowledgeable people I've ever met in this. And it was, what happened was kind of ironic. When she passed away, I remember, before that, I was thinking, boy, Rosemary must like me. She is so supportive. She's so kind to me. She must think I'm a really good egg. She's so nice to me all the time and always willing to take time or refer me to someone or something. I must really be on her good list.
Yeah.
And when she passed away, when somebody passes away, especially somebody within note of a particular community, you'll see people saying, so sad to hear of the passing.
Yeah.
And that was part of it. But the other part was this: Rosemary helped me out so much. Rosemary did this for me. Rosemary would always listen to me. Rosemary would always talk to me. And I thought to myself, here you thought you were so special, Jim. And she was that way with everyone. And just from a human perspective of somebody who was just a cool person, but yet extremely capable in her job, I thought that's a cool thing to say that you're absolutely one of the best at what you do, but maybe even more importantly, you're one of the best people. And boy, if you can get both of those going at the same time, that's a pretty good combination. So I think when you said who touched you the most, I think that would be the person. So and by the way, if you are interested in these subjects, ghosts, that type of thing, her books are still out there. Rosemary Ellen Guiley, Guiley. That's how you spell her last name. I highly recommend them. If you're interested in the ghosts and supernatural, you'll get no better education than you will by reading Rosemary's books.
I'll put her name and her books in the show notes so folks can follow up.
Thank you.
You've been on the air for a while now. Do you think that your shows have had an impact on public perception in terms of being more open to paranormal phenomenon?
I'll say maybe among the people that have heard them. I don't have any delusions of grandeur. You mentioned those big TV shows. I mean, those reach millions of people. And even though I've had millions of downloads, that's thousands of people downloading multiple times. That's not millions of people. So I don't have any delusions of grandeur about the size of my impact within the people who have listened to the shows. I do think that maybe I've broadened people's perspective or made them a little more accepting of other ideas and those things. Yes, but we're talking of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. We're not talking about millions of people like the Twilight Zone or or those things. So I just want to be clear, I don't have any delusions of grandeur here.
Okay, so when I think about all of your podcasts, all of the subjects, all of the phenomenon, I asked myself, what is the common denominator here? And this quote came to mind, quote, "Minds are like parachutes. They only function when they're open." Your podcast sets the bar to be open to the unknown. It has a curiosity, a rigor, respect, and at times sense of humor, a lot of times sense of humor. And you really are the gold standard for paranormal podcasting, Jim. And it's really wonderful that you've come on to FTC to talk to us about your amazing work. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And, that's extremely kind of you to say, but it's a pleasure. One of the cool things about this job is I get to meet people like you. And it's always great to talk to new people. And yeah, we try to cover it all and then let the audience decide their thoughts on it. That's kind of the idea. But thanks again, Pat. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you, listeners, for listening. And if you enjoy Fill to Capacity, please subscribe and tell your friends. Thank you. Bye.